Hi, everyone. Welcome. We will be reviewing the new mainstream notice, PIH 2024-30. I'm Emily Warren, a senior housing program specialist in the Housing Voucher Management and Operations Division, or HVMOD, and I'm joined by my colleague, Allison Bell. Allison, would you like to introduce yourself before we get started?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is, as Emily mentioned, Allison Bell, and I'm a policy advisor in the Office of Housing Voucher Programs and here to help facilitate the Q&A in the chat today. Thanks, Emily.
Thanks, Allison. And so please note that this webinar will be recorded and posted online. And after we review the notice, we will be taking written questions. And if we're unable to answer your question, please look for the answer in our forthcoming FAQs. First, here's a brief overview of mainstream vouchers. The first mainstream vouchers were awarded back in 1997. And in 2010, the Frank Melville Act converted mainstream to the regular Housing Choice Voucher program, though funding and reporting remain separate. To be eligible for mainstream, the family must have a person with a disability who is 18 years of age or older and less than 62 years of age. The eligible family member does not have to be the head of household. Other than that, than the non-elderly disabled requirement, mainstream vouchers follow the same program policies as the regular Housing Choice Voucher program. This chart shows how much the program has expanded in size over the last decade or so. Back in 2015, there were just under 15,000 mainstream vouchers nationally. Mainstream received a significant increase in funding for new vouchers back in 2017, and this new funding resulted in NOFO awards in 2017 and 2019. HUD received authority via the CARES Act to non-competitively award mainstream vouchers using carryover funding. And using this authority, HUD awarded an additional nearly 25,000 vouchers in 2020 and another 4,600 vouchers in 2022. This brings the total program size in 2024 to just over 71,000 vouchers, and we're currently at 80% utilization nationally. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that PHAs have encountered in administering mainstream vouchers, and then also some of the challenges that families have had in using their vouchers to kind of set the stage for the discussion of the flexibilities and alternative requirements that are included in the new notice. You might recognize this chart as some of the steps in the voucher process. There are, of course, other steps, but these are the ones that we're focusing on today. First, selection of applicants. Some PHAs have found that it can be challenging to identify mainstream eligible applicants from their HCV waiting list, especially if they're targeting a certain subgroup, such as people exiting institutions or people at risk of institutionalization. From the applicant perspective, we know that some mainstream applicants face barriers to providing the PHA with all of the documentation that's required for the PHA to determine eligibility. And some mainstream applicants could really benefit from application assistance. Next, after the PHA determines eligibility, the PHA issues the family its mainstream voucher and provides a briefing. Mainstream families receive a lot of information at this briefing, including their voucher expiration date and the process that they would go through for requesting a search extension if they haven't been able to locate a unit by the time their voucher expires. We'll come back to that. Next, the family searches for a unit. The median search time for mainstream participants in the last 18 months is 60 days. Meaning that some families are taking less than 60 days, but just as many families require additional search time beyond 60 days, especially in really challenging rental markets. For a lot of different reasons, such as the need for an accessible unit or a unit near medical services, mainstream participants may require additional search time and housing search assistance to successfully use their voucher. And this slide just illustrates my point that I made just now about how mainstream families are often requiring more search time and more support. This shows the percentage of issuances that successfully establish a lease within 180 days among some of the different special purpose voucher programs that we have. As you can see, emergency housing vouchers on the far left and HUD-VASH on the far right are the highest, meaning that they have the largest proportion of applicants in those programs that are able to successfully use their voucher. There are different reasons for why this might be, such as the built-in case management component for HUD-VASH or the services fees for emergency housing vouchers that can pay for things like security deposits, et cetera. Perhaps you can think of some other reasons as well. But my point here is that the 60-day search time is not sufficient for a lot of mainstream families. Now, with that background, let's move into an overview of the new notice. To establish these optional waivers and alternative requirements, HUD is using the authority provided by Congress in the 2024 Consolidated Appropriations Act. And I've highlighted the most relevant portion in yellow at the bottom, which states that HUD may waive statutory and regulatory provisions related to waiting lists, local preferences, the initial term, and extensions of term for mainstream. And using this authority, HUD is implementing these optional waivers and alternative requirements via PIH notice. The notice applies to all PHAs administering mainstream vouchers, including those that administer mainstream vouchers through portability. The notice does not apply to net vouchers. The notice is effective upon its publication date of August 20th, 2024, and PHAs have 120 days from that publication date to adopt the alternative requirements. First, I'll review the mandatory policies or alternative requirements. First, HUD is waiving 982-303A and requiring that all initial search terms for mainstream must be a minimum of 120 days instead of 60 days. This also applies to current mainstream participants who choose to move. Next, HUD is waiving 983-303B1 and is requiring PHAs to approve all initial extension requests. And that initial extension must be for a minimum of 90 days. The PHA must approve the initial extension request regardless of whether the request is made in writing or verbally, and without regard for the circumstances for why the extension is needed, as long as the request is made on or before the term expiration date. After the initial request is granted, the PHA's policies for extension requests in their administrative plan would apply. The PHA must also notify the family on at least one occasion after the voucher issuance of the term expiration date. They must also notify the family of the PHA's process for requesting an extension and inquire if the family is in need of housing search assistance. In providing notice to families of the expiration date and extension request process, PHAs must ensure effective communication with persons with disabilities, including those with vision, hearing, speech, intellectual, or other developmental disabilities, or any other communication-related disabilities. Please note that this alternative requirement does not impact the reasonable accommodation process that's available to all mainstream families under 982-303B2. In the final alternative requirement or mandatory policy, HUD is waiving 982-207B1, and PHAs cannot apply residency preferences to mainstream voucher applicants. Please note that per 982-207-1I, residency requirements are already prohibited both in mainstream and in the regular HCV program. This alternative requirement specifically prohibits residency preferences. Okay, so moving on to the discretionary policies or optional waivers. HUD is waiving 982-204F, and PHAs may choose to adopt a separate mainstream waiting list. PHAs must inform families on their HCV waiting list via public notice about the establishment of a separate mainstream waiting list, and also provide families with sufficient time to notify the PHA that they'd like to join the mainstream waiting list. Joining the mainstream waiting list does not affect an applicant's placement on the HCV waiting list. And there's some additional information in the notice about the process that PHAs should undertake when establishing a separate waiting list, particularly around ensuring that eligible families are aware of the new waiting list. PHAs considering establishing a separate waiting list should review section 7A of the notice and reach out if they have any questions. For the other discretionary policy, HUD is waiving 982-207A, and PHAs may adopt separate mainstream preferences. If a PHA chooses to have a referral-based preference for mainstream, PHAs must make information publicly available about what agencies they're accepting mainstream referrals from. HUD also strongly encourages PHAs to formalize partnerships with referring agencies, and there's a link to a sample MOU in the notice that you might recognize if you work with emergency housing vouchers. Through referral partnerships, PHAs must ensure that persons of all disability types have access to mainstream, but they can have a disability-specific referral source. So you might wonder what that could look like to have both a disability-specific referral source, but also ensure that persons with all disability types have access to mainstream vouchers. So for example, let's say your PHA has a state Medicaid office that has an 1115 demonstration project, and they're covering some housing-related services for Medicaid participants, things like security deposits, moving expenses, et cetera. And let's say your Medicaid office is targeting through that demonstration a specific group of Medicaid participants. For example, persons with a substance abuse disorder. If your PHA wishes to adopt a mainstream preference for applicants referred by your Medicaid program, you would also need to adopt a preference for applicants from a provider that serves all disability types. There is a non-exhaustive list of providers in the notice on page 8 in section 7B of these types of providers that serve people of all disability types. One example would be a continuum of care. And earlier I talked about some of the challenges that mainstream applicants might face in completing an application and in securing a unit. PHAs using an agency for referrals might find it helpful to execute an MOU with that agency, and in that MOU, specify the services that the referring agency will provide to the mainstream family, with some examples of those services being application assistance, housing search assistance, any financial resources that the agency can provide, like security deposit assistance, and also any ongoing supportive services as needed. And this section of the notice also reminds PHAs that if they agree to adopt a preference as part of a NOFO application back in 2017 or 2019, they must continue to have that preference. Okay, so this slide is a summary of the different discretionary and mandatory policies that I've talked about. Just for your reference, we've reviewed the mandatory policies, the 120-day minimum search term, approving all initial extension requests for 90 days, notifying the family of the search extension process and the voucher expiration date, the prohibition on residency preferences, and we reviewed the discretionary policies, establishing a separate mainstream waiting list and separate mainstream preferences. There's also a very similar attachment in the notice that you might find useful for reference. And before we go to questions, I've just listed here a few resources that might be helpful that are on our mainstream website. There's an Excel sheet called Mainstream Awards by PHA and Funding Opportunity, which shows which PHAs have mainstream vouchers and when they were awarded. You can also see which PHAs administer mainstream vouchers and how many are being used on our mainstream dashboard, and I can put a link to that in the chat. On the mainstream website, you can also find our most recent mainstream FAQs, which primarily cover a lot of project-based voucher questions. And as I mentioned, we will be putting out some FAQs based on the notice, based on questions that we get today and also questions that have come into our mainstream voucher mailbox. There's also a link on the mainstream website to some resources that are on HUD Exchange. Those are mainly some topic guides that you might find useful. So please note that the topic guides were published before this notice was published. So with that, that is the end of the presentation, and I will check with Allison to see if we've had any questions come into the chat that we could answer.
Hey, Emily, awesome presentation. Yes, we have questions. We just got a couple like right there at the end that I'm organizing. So I think one of the first ones is, will these slides be available?
Yes, we will publish on the mainstream website the recording of the webinar as well as the slide deck.
Great. And then there was a question about receiving, can you please add me to the email group once the slides are shared? And I'm not sure if there is an email group that these slides are shared, or if everyone should just go to the mainstream webpage, and I can put the link in the chat here.
There is a mainstream email group that I actually have never used, and I'm not sure if it's been used in recent years. So I think the best way to find out when the slides are posted is that will get put into multiple newsletters, so including the HCV newsletter, the PIH newsletter. Those would be the best ways to see when that's posted.
Okay, great. And I did just put the link to the mainstream webpage in the chat. All right, Emily. One question we received was earlier in the slide deck, you were sharing some typical timeframes for leasing for special purpose vouchers. And a question came in about, how do those timeframes that you reviewed compare to the regular HCV program? Do you have that data?
I don't have it handy. Maybe that's something that we could address in the FAQs. But I don't know that I don't know off the top of my head how the leasing search times compare to the regular housing choice voucher program.
We did receive some questions in the chat, and forgive me, folks, for asking them a little bit out of order that they came in. But some of them are like factual for the notice, Emily, and I thought maybe those would be easier to grab first. So one is, could you please explain the disability specific preference waiver again?
So in this notice, we clarify there's no waiver or alternative requirement attached to this, but in this notice, in section 7B, we clarify that PHAs can have a preference for applicants referred by a partnering agency that is disability specific, as long as they are cumulatively serving people with all types of disabilities. So there's no specific waiver attached to this. This is just something that we're trying to make more clear to PHAs in this notice.
Okay. Emily, I probably have another 6 questions or so for you, just to give you a sense, and apologies for pausing while I'm going to grab them. So 2 questions relate to the residency preference. So one is, what can small housing authorities do to keep their mainstream local to assist those needing to transition under programs like MFP in their service area? And then similarly, and this is related to residency, but a slightly different question. If a PHA requires folks to live in the jurisdiction for 1 year before moving, are you saying that for the prohibition on residency preferences is now unacceptable, which I think is a slightly different issue, but asking you both to basically talk again about residency preferences?
Sure. So we've received some questions about whether the prohibition on residency preferences affects the ability, the requirement that some PHAs have restricting portability for non-residents within the first 12 months. No, it does not. PHAs can still have the option to do that. Let's see. So the first part of the question, though, was about, sorry, can you repeat the first question, Allison?
Yes. What can small housing authorities do to keep their mainstream program local to assist those needing to transition under programs like Money Follows the Person in their service area?
So we can definitely try to address, this is a great question and we can try to address it more in the FAQ. But in terms of, so there's a list in the notice of potential partnering agencies that might make good referral sources for mainstream. And so I think taking a look at some of which of those are in your community, what is their catchment area like, their service area like, and how does that line up with your jurisdiction? Those might be helpful things to consider when you think about what agencies might make good referral partners for mainstream.
Okay. Let's see. There's a couple of questions here that are very specific to a PHA. So we might come back to those, Emily. But I have a couple questions here about administrative plans. And that is, will PHAs need to amend their admin plans first before implementing the mandatory policies? And they have in parentheses, we're assuming that they must update their plans before adopting the discretionary policies. And okay, that's the first part of the admin plan question. I'll stop there.
So since PHAs only need to include discretionary policies in their administrative plan, tell me if that sounds right to you, Allison. They would not need to update their administrative plan in order to adopt those the mandatory policies within the 120-day timeframe that the notice references. But they would need to update their administrative plan before adopting any of the discretionary policies.
Another question that we received a little bit earlier was, can you please clarify what actions PHA should take regarding providing housing search assistance for families having trouble finding housing during the voucher issuance or extension? As PHAs are not housing navigators, what is expected regarding housing search support?
We can include a response to this in the FAQs because I can't see the notice in front of me. It's not on my screen, but we do reference in the notice the regulation, the regulatory citation that requires PHAs to provide some housing search assistance to mainstream applicants, to people with disabilities. So that's something we could expand upon in the FAQ to the extent that we can about what exactly that means. But I think that's something we'll have to try to address more in the FAQs.
One person wrote in, I want to clarify the voucher term. Initial issuance 90 days with 120-day extension if requested. So they're asking for clarification really on what the notice says about voucher search term.
So the initial search term is for a minimum of 120 days, and then the family, if they request it, must be approved for a minimum 90-day extension. So essentially, if the family requests an extension, they're guaranteed a search time of 210 days. If they request it within the time period under which they are required to do so before the term expiration.
Right. This question is about notifying applicants of changes. So, will assistance be provided to PHAs in notifying applicants of the changes? Our HCV waiting list includes thousands of applicants, and many PHAs lack capacity to handle such large-scale mailings.
So we are working on a technical assistance opportunity that would hopefully help PHAs who are trying to work through that type of process. If there's something, if it would help for the PHA to talk with me and some other folks at HV Mod who are, when you're trying to go through that process about to establish a separate waiting list, that's something that we're happy to discuss with you. Send an email to mainstreamvouchers@hud.gov. But we are working on some technical assistance opportunities around that as well.
Okay. Related to something we just recently covered, how many extensions can a family ask for?
This depends on the PHA's administrative plan. So per the notice, the PHA must approve the initial extension requests. But whether the PHA grants additional extension requests beyond that depends on they would follow the policies as stated in their administrative plan.
Will more mainstream vouchers be made available to PHAs with mainstream programs?
So in the 2024 Consolidated Appropriations Act, there was no funding for new mainstream vouchers. So there are no plans at this time for additional mainstream vouchers.
I'm still working on questions. They're coming in fast in the chat. So Emily, we have a couple more questions about preferences again. So let me see if I can try to find a way to weave these together. I'm actually wondering if it might be better for you to just recap what the notice says on preferences and see if that resolves these questions. And once you recap what the notice says on preferences, I can follow up with maybe some follow-up questions that I have here. Is that okay?
Sure. So one of the discretionary policies that's available now to PHAs is to establish separate mainstream preferences. It was a little bit confusing before this notice came out because PHAs did agree in previous NOFOs to adopt some preferences that were, at least in theory, intended to apply just to mainstream applicants, but they had to apply them to the entire HCV waiting list. So now PHAs have an option to establish preferences just for mainstream. And one of the more common types of preferences is to establish a preference for applicants that are referred by a certain agency, which can be helpful if a PHA is targeting a specific subgroup, such as people experiencing homelessness, people exiting institutions or at risk of institutionalization. So the only new waiver around preferences is to establish separate mainstream preferences. But we are hopefully clarifying in this notice what is possible for a PHA if they are interested in or if they have referral-based preferences.
So I think you covered this, but I think this is just an example from a housing authority. So for the disability preference, if we wanted to have a preference for permanent supportive housing eligible referrals, could we do that?
Let me address that in the FAQ. I actually think that's in an old mainstream NOFO FAQ, so it should be an easy answer, or feel free to email mainstreamvouchers@hud.gov if you'd like to get a quicker response.
Okay. Um, this one is about preferences again, and I think this one's more about the residency preference. So we have an existing residency preference and one HCV waiting list. If we cannot apply a residency preference, it sounds as though HUD is forcing agencies like ours to create a mainstream specific list and or the elimination of residency preferences for all HCV waiting lists. I think this is really a question about how can you not apply the residency preference when you're going to select for mainstream.
Right. So you would have to not apply that preference to mainstream applicants on your HCV waiting list. But that's definitely a question that we can also address in the FAQs to try to provide a more detailed answer.
I've received a couple of questions about requesting waivers to this notice. Not sure if that's something we can answer today or if that's something that you could address in a FAQ later.
Yes, we can address that in the FAQ.
Okay. Then I have two questions that I think are more about general mainstream policy and not necessarily anything that's changing in this notice, but maybe somewhat changing in the notice. So the first is, can mainstream applicants port out even if the other PHA does not have a mainstream program? Would they be allowed to turn the applicant away?
No, they would not be allowed to turn the applicant away. They would either, I know we have this in an FAQ. I will put this in our new FAQs as well.
And this one is, if a mainstream household no longer contains an eligible member, for example, a disabled person has left the household, will the PHA still be able to transition the family to a regular HCV if the family was issued a voucher from a separate mainstream waiting list?
Let's see. So I don't see why that policy would change even in the event of a separate waiting list, but we will address that in the FAQs.
Okay. Some great FAQ
Yes.
fodder today. Let's see. There was a question earlier that said, do you foresee any similar changes to the NED program? We are a statewide agency that administers both NED and mainstream, and they are serving substantially similar populations and have the same needs and barriers.
So I believe in our 2025 congressional justifications, HUD asked for the same flexibilities that we have for mainstream for NED. So I can understand why the same flexibilities would be helpful for NED.
Okay. I'm gonna look here, Emily, to see if some let's see. There's a question about some of our mainstream clients are now older than 62. Do they remain mainstream or do we need to replace them?
Nope, they remain mainstream because eligibility is only determined at the time of admission, so they don't age out of mainstream.
Let's see. Received another question about, will the recording be made available? Yes, it will be, and it will be on it'll be posted on the mainstream webpage. And Emily, I'm being asked to provide a link in the chat for the notice. I don't know if you have that handy. I can grab it here in a moment.
Let me stop sharing my screen and then I'm happy to put that in the chat.
And so there's a question in the chat about, do we have to wait until receiving the waiver to implement these new procedures with mainstream? And so I'm wondering if there's maybe maybe it might be useful to talk about how these are mandatory policies in some cases, and in other cases they're discretionary policies, and the notice is not describing any kind of waiver that you need to submit to HUD to be able to do this.
Right. Somewhat confusingly, the word waiver is in the title of the notice, but as Allison said, these are mandatory policies, which PHAs have 120 days from the time of publication to adopt. And then there are the discretionary policies, which there's no timeline for PHAs to adopt those. No requirement.
And we've received a question to see if you could share the rationale for the local residency preference policy for mainstream.
Sure. So there is a prohibition on applying residency preferences for a couple of our special purpose voucher programs. So for emergency housing vouchers, for stability vouchers, for HUD-VASH. So the thought is that if you're serving people who are experiencing homelessness or institutionalized, they may be doing so outside of the PHA's jurisdiction and sometimes by necessity. So that's sort of the thinking on residency preferences as they apply to mainstream.
And then received a question about, when do these changes go into effect?
So PHAs have 120 days to establish or adopt the mandatory policies, and they're free to adopt the discretionary policies whenever they'd like, as long as they go through the process of updating their admin plan to reflect the discretionary policies.
Emily, I think I've asked you most of the questions that I've seen in the chat, and my apologies if I've missed anything. The chat feature can be a little clunky at times. But I know, Emily, we have a copy of the questions that are in the chat, and you'll be looking at them for your FAQ. So if we missed it, if I missed it, won't blame Emily. If I missed it, it is something that we will take a look at, and I apologize if I overlooked it today, but these were really fantastic questions that were in the chat. So Emily, I will turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Allison. Excellent question posing, and please look for the recording and slides on the website. I will look into this mysterious mainstream listserv and see if it's possible to send out a link to those items on the listserv. So I'll turn it back to you, Stacy.
Thank you. That concludes our conference. You may now disconnect.